Oh boy, NASA, why are you getting into this? Hello, wonderful person, this is Anton, and I guess I'm going to have to talk about this after all. About a week ago from when I'm making this video, NASA has officially announced that they're going to be setting up a kind of an independent group to study the so-called UAPs, also more commonly known as UFOs. And that's where a lot of science communicators sort of scratch their head and realize that we don't really know, or at least I don't really know, what to think and how to talk about this. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my own opinions about this near the end of the video, but I actually decided to sort of plagiarize a little bit and read this beautiful post by another science communicator, Nadia Drake, the daughter of the iconic Drake. Not this Drake, but this one, Dr. Frank Drake, the scientist behind the iconic Drake equation, the equation that tries to estimate the total number of alien civilizations potentially living out there. Although personally, I have to apologize to Nadia for basically using her father to try to explain who she is, because I'm sure she's a wonderful person in her own right. But sometimes for a child of an iconic person, it sort of becomes pretty difficult to live up to the society's expectations. Although she's doing pretty fine, she's actually writing incredible articles, and I definitely enjoy reading all of them. So anyway, here's what she wrote. By now you've all heard that NASA is convening a panel to look into UFOs. I took about 24 hours to reflect on what seemed like an interesting and somewhat unexpected move. First and most importantly, I really wish the on-hold music for yesterday's press briefing had been the X-Files theme. Okay, NASA is clearly not the FBI, but still, missed opportunity. More seriously, is it weird that NASA is investing resources in studying UAP? Yes, in the sense that UAP are as much a cultural phenomenon as they are aerial. It's a bit like
In
convening a task
space,
force to
Joel,
study
too.
ghosts, or pick your favorite paranormal thing, which yes, that's odd. And I think one of the biggest questions is, why do this now? On the other hand, it makes perfect sense for a space agency to focus on these reports. As others have noted, the first A in NASA is aeronautics, so why not take a look at what might be buzzing around Earth by harnessing the power of science and the scientific method? To me, it sounds
Yeah,
like taking a hard look at the available data
if
for the
other
goal of the study,
regions don't fit
not going on an
assumptions,
alien hunt. And I don't think
assumptions
the
of
headlines framing
pareidolia,
this as
of the
UFO
region of
hunting are
pareidolia.
correct. Catchy, yes. Accurate, no. I don't buy for a second that anyone involved reasonably expects to find evidence of extraterrestrial technology here.
Yeah, it
To
could be
me, that
anything.
didn't sound like the goal of the endeavor, which seems more geared toward reactive
Unidentified.
analysis and patching observational holes. I also don't think there is much of a connection between this inquiry and NASA's astrobiology research. The latter is a maturing field of science that NASA has been cultivating for decades. This UAP panel, not really in line with that, in my opinion. Rather, I believe Dr. Zurbuchen when he said that it makes sense to apply the scientific method as we would with any natural phenomenon.
Yes, the observation of pareidolia.
There's been many times when something that looked almost magical turned out to be new science.
Define science,
Don't ever
magic.
underestimate what nature can do for you. There's a lot to learn. And from Dr. Spergel, who's leading the panel, we don't know what makes up 95% of the universe. There is a lot we don't know about how the cosmos works. In other words, I don't see this study as throwing a bone to the folks who truly believe we've been visited by extraterrestrials.
Could be anything.
It's just a good way of figuring out how to address and understand a puzzling set of data. When I asked my Papa D, that's Papa D by the way, you know the guy who might want to find evidence of smart aliens more than just about any human on the planet, but who is also 100% skeptical on UFO sightings, he offered the following thought. You can't just throw it all away. It's worth plowing through. True to his word, he's done a fair share of investigating sightings over the decades and has never been even remotely convinced.
Bias,
So I'm really curious
skeptic.
to see how this all plays out,
Never.
and I'll be disappointed if the big takeaway is that the study lends validity to the belief that UAP are evidence of extraterrestrial technology.
Disappointed?
Those dots don't connect.
So much for wanting to find aliens.
Will.
You'd be disappointed?
That's an inevitable response. We'll see. That's all from me for now. Live long and prosper. And honestly, I could not have. It's true that the idea of UFOs or UAPs, whatever you want to call them, up until now has been a bit of a taboo, mostly because, well, I mean, what exactly are we going to be studying? Are we studying
unidentified?
Are we actually going to be studying observations? And as a matter of fact, so far none of this has been science. None of this has been scientific at all. And
yes, it
here's
has.
the important part. So if I use the website that I've been using for decades to try to collect papers and try to read through various studies, the website that has the largest collection of all of the astronomical papers in existence, Archive, and if I try to search for UFOs or UAPs or studies related to that, here's what I find. And just for fun, take a guess how many I'm going to find. Take a guess. I'm going to wait. So for UFOs, I find 155, but none of them are related to what we're talking about. because UFOs also mean unified feature optimization, or ultra-fast outflows. And the list goes on. If I were to look up unidentified flying objects, I find one single paper. And wait a second, it's from James Davenport. I've read his stuff before, he's actually really good. And it's a legit paper about studying UFOs using various types of new surveys, where he basically talks about how we could potentially find these objects as tiny specks of light in
Techno-signatures.
modern telescopes.
Techno-signatures.
Nobody's ever talked about this before. This sounds kind of interesting, but then it sort of hit me. Is it gonna hit you too? Look closer. Much closer. No, look again. Yeah, there we go. It was an April Fool's joke. So that's kind of where we are. A lot of scientists and a lot of science communicators, and actually a lot of people in general, do not think of this, whatever that is, as anything worth studying scientifically, mostly because, well, first of all, there doesn't seem to be an agreement on what people are seeing and if they're seeing.
It's in the name,
and second of all,
UFO,
there's really no
unidentified.
to study any of this right now.
Yes,
And
there
for
are.
previous research, such as the famous Project Blue Book, well, unfortunately, it does have a lot of conflicts inside of it, and the conclusions at the end of the project were super inconclusive. And as a matter of fact, when I actually first heard about this, my first question was not why it took so long, like with Nadia Drake. My first question was, is someone actually forcing them to do this? Is it somehow related to the pressure from other government agencies, where they're basically forced to release everything they have on these UAPs? And the answer is probably yes. I think there is some kind of a political pressure, but I don't want to go into politics or the reasons. I really, for now at least, until they publish something, want to focus on the facts, and I guess to some extent, my opinions at the end. So first of all, the facts. One of the main reasons to investigate the phenomenon is to actually see if it does have any danger to a lot of airplanes. This is, if it exists, an article phenomenon, actually causing air safety, and is there any national security issues here as well?
But they do
And so
invade,
trying to figure
restrict
out if these
airspace,
phenomena
even
are
shut
natural
down
and
missile
are possibly
tests.
observations or misinterpretation message from NASA. They mentioned this several times. There's absolutely no evidence. There's no evidence at all. That
You also say there's no
are somehow
evidence
related to extraterrestrial intelligence.
that
And
Bill
even
Clinton
though
has
kind of
sexual relation with that woman,
Remember,
or
NASA
no
has been
evidence
actually searching for
that
extraterrestrial intelligence for
Richard
several
Nixon
decades. There are
or that there is no evidence that Richard Nixon deliberately extended the war in Vietnam to take credit for ending the war in Vietnam. Or Bill Barr said there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud in 2020, and all the evidence is what you expect from mail-in ballots, and also there's no evidence that mail-in ballots are prone to fraud. Let's pick one. I mean, that's no evidence can also be seen for a bias. People say there's no evidence for evolution. No evidence could also be for denial. Anyone can say no evidence. You know, the amount of nitrogen to account for a Moa's sun acceleration would be more than the entire universe, outgassing from the part facing away from the sun. But it's never aliens, even when you have to make much more assumptions to rule out aliens, to say it's not aliens. You have to make more mental leaps.
And you have to really kind of focus on this. Remember, NASA has been actually searching for aliens, for extraterrestrial intelligence, for several decades. There are several very important and very prominent institutes, such as SETI, for example, that have been doing this for so long. And
as I've been saying, it is impossible to send a clear, decipherable message over light years. I mean, there's too much interference, even dust and natural energy. But other stuff you find that turns out to be natural, then that's interference. Even other artificial signals might be interference with other artificial signals coming out the gibberish. They already found like 6 unexplained signals, including the wow signal. Maybe any messages get all scrambled up over light years, from dust, natural energy bursts, black holes, and maybe other UFOs and other stuff, even dust coming between the message.
Compiled tons and tons of data. None of this suggests that these phenomena are somehow related, or that there's really anything going on Earth that could have potentially come from outer space. There's no evidence for this whatsoever.
Oh, how DNA, how long it is, how old it is. It's 9 billion years old. Our DNA is 9 billion years old.
Why is it that always whenever you hear UFOs, people think aliens? Well, that's how our brain works. That's essentially
That's how our culture works.
And all of this really started back in 1947. Pictures like this, with this being Major Jesse Marcel posing with the debris he found in 1947.
That's not the debris, that's the cover-up debris.
Some sort of aluminium foil.
That's what they said with the weather balloon.
That this is probably some kind of a weather balloon, It's most likely to have been some kind of a military experiment, and the US military has been conducting its own psychology. All of this has more to do with the psychological concepts than it does with physical concepts. There are so many different biases at work here, and so it's actually extremely difficult for us, human beings, to interpret the world without some kind of a standardized way, such as science. We have
How about
so many
babies?
biases, and so many of them have created these concepts.
Like it's never alien,
And
that's a
actually,
bias.
the most important psychological bias that does apply to this phenomenon is known as the representativeness heuristic. It's sort of related to how we assign code blind spot bias. It's essentially not actually realizing that you're biased at all.
Aren't deniers of a bias?
Clustering illusion, and this is a tendency for us to see patterns in random events. And we also have very important.
Isn't science help look for patterns?
To information that literally have very important confirmation bias. We tend to only listen to information that literally confirms what we already believe.
That's more common with deniers and skeptics.
Not really listen to the information that contradicts their view already. That's very, very common.
And most of the skeptics and deniers.
There's another really important bias.
You have a rule it's never aliens.
There is something known as the conservatism bias. It's essentially where people believe prior evidence more than new evidence or information that has emerged. In other words, people that have already established their belief in UFOs as aliens.
What about their denial? More like he's dead. It sounds like look at your face. You're a little bit angry. I can see it right here. See anger on your face. It's like you sound like a little bit of a projection here, or maybe not a projection, understanding. You don't want to see maybe deniers too. I mean, a mole, for example. Not just a lot of the functions miss critical detail.
Well, it's going to be extremely hard to convince them otherwise. Wait, there's more. There's actually.
Why do they see no evidence?
Why do people even interpret these UFOs or these unusual objects in the skies as something super weird, something super unusual, such as aliens? Well, this is where this other idea.
Why no making no sound with acceleration?
The tendency for human brain to focus on the most easily recognizable features of a person or a concept. Something very weird and something very unusual. In other words, people generally almost instantly focus on the weird stuff.
What about normalcy bias?
Or stuff that's kind of normal and kind of.
What about trying to make everything normal? What's the normalcy bias?
Alien technology, we instantly click on the video. If we hear aliens are just basically some weird air phenomena we just didn't know existed, it's just not weird enough, and people.
Depending on your denier.
And that's basically our selective perception at work. We tend to have expectations about the world, and we only tend to focus on those expectations.
So why you see no evidence for things you don't believe, say don't exist?
We hear things we want to hear. However,
and you don't hear things you don't want to hear, like any evidence contradicting your belief.
And that's the study memory. So one of the main differences in early UFO studies, so here we're talking about the Project Blue Book, compared to what's going on, is the fact that we've learned so much about how human memory works. Definitively established that human memory does not work like your typical computer.
You have billions of computers.
And so when we're forming new memories, it's not just bits of information being saved inside our brains. But instead, if we were to look at two people forming the same memory, their biases and their, lenses, and here we're talking about cognitive, would actually form two completely different memories on their biases, perception, based on their expectations about things in life. And that's, of course, the most important part. In other words, memory formation is a very active process that's entirely based on your life experiences to date. But memories, it's not just bits of information inside our brains. But instead, if we were to look at two separate people forming the same memory, their biases and their, lenses, and here we're talking about cognitive lenses, would actually form two completely different memories based on their biases, based on their perception, based on their expectation. Recalling these memories, it's once again not just reading a hard drive. It's also an active process, and once again also based on your bias and your expectations in life, but this time right now, not the ones from before. Meaning that if recalling these memories is a very active based on your life experiences to date. Differently, and we're going to remember them very differently. Formation is a very active process that's
normalcy bias
on your life experience, not the ones from before. Meaning that if you're recalling the same memory, let's just say a decade later, you're not going to be remembering the same thing at all. You're going to be remembering your idea of this memory as you would interpret it today. And these memories in neuropsychology are very often referred to as engrams, and I briefly talked about this in one of the previous videos about neurons that you can probably find somewhere in the description, or maybe somewhere right there. But the idea here is somewhat complicated. Memories is different, they always change, and they change as you
No, they
get older.
don't.
And I guess that's a bit of a scary part. As we get older, our actual memories change as well. and what we remember is different from how it really was. All of this is, by the way, based on like decades and decades of different studies.
Pieces get
And
stronger.
this has been confirmed so many times. Two people seeing the same thing are not going to be remembering the same thing the same way. More importantly, there's also something known as false memory.
Actually, the contrary gets confirmed so many times. We have a clear memory we haven't looked at in a while that's clearer than any other memory looked at before. It's crystal clear. Also, emotions, feeling, recreating a situation, and way for recalling memory, having memory just flow back to you, or piece back.
More importantly, there's also something known as false memories. And that's, of course, the concept that became super important in the last 2 decades. We always form false memories. Memories of events that did not happen or did not exist. And unfortunately, there's really no way for us to know if they really happened.
Yes, they are.
Because that's not how our brain works.
You recognize the feeling of imagining the memory or feeling the memory. It feels like you can just feel your brain is creating, or if it's recalling or repiecing. As imagine, sometimes it's like imagination of you bring back memory. Your brain doesn't build from scratch. It doesn't build from nothing. Just say you've been in a situation. If you're creating a situation, your brain is deciding how to feel. If you've been in that situation, that perspective, your neurons already know how to feel and start piecing stuff back together. Often you'd have 2 copies of the same memory, or a memory wasn't clear in the first place.
The most iconic false memory that seemed to have affected a lot of people is the so-called Mandela effect. It's this strange and unusual memory a lot of people used to have, a memory that was actually quite vivid and quite detailed. The South African Nelson Mandela in prison in the 80s. Whereas in reality, he died in 2013. The more interesting example that some people might relate to is the memory of the movie that never existed. There are actually people that are convinced that the comedian Sinbad was the main actor in the movie Shazam, the movie that came out in the 90s. He wasn't though. This movie doesn't exist and he's never played in it. Neil, but not the same at all. Yet for many years, a lot of people that grew up in the 90s were convinced that it was real. Because of this, there is a movie called Kazam with Shaquille O'Neal, but not the same at all. Yet for many...
Those sound like false information rather than false memories. You get the false bad information in the first place. Maybe you didn't care to fact check it and it became real, but gain the information whether it is a genuine memory. That is not a false memory, it's false information. It's memorizing false information. The Mandela effect, you just probably just overheard he died or assumed he died. Or were told he died and didn't question it. Or recall being told or didn't check it. That is not a false memory, it's the information in the first place.
This is where I'm actually going to mention Michio Kaku, who recently talked about this to some extent, which by the way is also a really good example of bias once again. In one of the recent interviews, he talked about how the military is now basically releasing hours of videotapes of things that defy normal laws of physics. We now have frame-by-frame analysis of these objects. These objects can drop 70,000 feet in a few seconds, suggesting that something strange is maybe going on here after all. Okay, well here's the thing though, that's not that video. This one is just produced by someone else.
You don't mention that the original Tic Tac, the exhaust actually got cooler. The air running exhaust was cooler than the surrounding environment.
It doesn't show anything extraordinary or anything unusual. And here's the important part. Every single one of these released videos so far has been definitively proven to show absolutely nothing extra.
According to your bias that leaves stuff out, major details, like the sun acceleration yet no noise, not even from air displacement, meaning the air might be being sucked back. Maybe it's working by, maybe watching warp in the first place, at least warping the air. The sonic boom was being pulled back, so that kind of taking momentum out of the air that's being displaced. And you're also taking them from multiple cameras, multiple angles.
Wonderful people like Mick West right here, who's been doing this pretty much weekly.
Using his bias.
He gets a...
I used to watch Ken Hovind videos to compare skeptics like this to like experiencing creationists, anti-evolutionists really show at some point the burden of proof should be on the denier. Anyone can say they see no evidence of anything. If you say they see no evidence the earth is round.
Doing this pretty much weekly, or sometimes even daily. He gets a lot of different videos, and he's been doing this for many years.
Mick West.
He's very good at basically discrediting anything we're seeing, and even showing exactly what's going
You're
on.
biased, and you're missing details.
None of his videos showed anything extraordinary.
If he edited videos,
leaving
your details.
You absolutely have to follow Mick, because he's been doing an absolutely incredible job. Such an incredible
So,
job.
confirmation
I've
bias?
sort of realized that whenever he says something is really weird and unusual, maybe something is worth investigating after all, that's when I'm going to start believing something is out there.
Wait, so you just give everyone else a confirmation bias? Yeah, you're showing your confirmation bias.
You can also check out my previous video that I've made, I guess about a year ago, that goes through all of this in more detail.
It actually leaves out major details.
Alternatively, you can also check out this other video that's also in the description below, that essentially has several video effects artists, as a matter of fact, talking about all of this, specifically discussing what they're observing, what exactly it's probably showing, and more importantly, specifically stating that nothing here is unusual. In most cases, like for example, in this famous case, that's basically nothing but an out-of-focus airplane with the triangular shape itself
Airplanes will keep moving.
by the aperture of the camera. A lot of
and it appeared, even it continued when the airplane appeared.
And so none of this, absolutely none of this is
They're from Skinwalker Ranch.
Or it requires an explanation.
And when it appeared, airplanes will keep
moving. I want
moving.
to come back to this particular tweet from Mick West, where he challenged Michio Kaku to back up his claims that there are unusual phenomena happening somewhere out there and that they were actually filmed and documented. I haven't seen one. He hasn't.
You have a
seen one.
confirmation
I don't think
bias.
anyone has seen one. And if someone thinks they've seen,
Because of your own bias. You both taken in from space, in and out of atmosphere.
memories. So, Dr. Kaku, it's all on you now.
False information. You showed. Well, yeah, you can't remember stuff you imagine. It's kind of cycle of dangerous to not trust your own mind. That's how you convert with occults and stuff. Not even religious cults, but having, what they don't claim to be religious, but they do your thinking for you. Without saying it's a solid memory. I mean, how does scientific and simulation theory? At some point, pareidolia cannot be falsified. Why not just assume you're in a coma and you can create any world you want?